If everybody's okay, we will move to the panel session now. We would like to invite people to contribute verbally, so you can switch off your microphones and ask questions. Raise your hand, and then we'll come to you so that you can put your question to the panel. Craig and Christiana, great, you're back. Okay.
There's Gail Fraser.
Yeah. Gail.
So, yes, I wouldn't have done, but I'll try and kick this off. It's just to push the education front. Sorry, I put a bit in the chat about it, but where do we start? I've spoken quite a lot to people at Robert Hairston's who's tried to set up the new sort of timber cat in England, but doesn't get people signing up. It's not just engineers, it's also architects, it's also builders. Everyone across the board has to understand what the maximum potential of each type of timber is. And where do we start? At the moment, engineers are trained much more in steel and concrete than they are in timber. But yes, it's how do we bring everyone on board?
I could start with that. The Structural Timber Association and Timber Development UK is a great start point. TRADA used to do education programs for universities. TRADA has kind of been sold a couple of times now, but Timber Development UK and the Structural Timber Association have lots of assets that are usable to degree level and beyond training. There is also something called Wood Campus, which is a fantastic resource, but almost nobody knows it exists. And I'll try and put that in the chat. And then, yes, you're quite right. The focus has been on how do you size a steel beam and how do you do concrete? There is nothing intrinsically wrong with any of those materials. It's now optimizing the use of those materials with others. And timber is a long established and highly engineered, not weird one. I work in straw, that's a little bit funky, but timber engineering is completely not anything other than it should just be absolutely core on the curriculum for architects and engineers. Simply, we just got to go as Trado once did, but maybe TD UK, maybe Grown in Britain and others could say we should now go and just contact every engineering faculty, Department of Architecture and product design and say, you are not dealing with your climate emergency obligations here. You need to do the programs.
The thing as well, Craig, I mean, that's a great point made, is that, there's some lobbying to be done by these organizations that can just pitch up in front of local MSPs and let them see the connection between, a specifier saying C24 all the time, and that they're never going to start getting more and more materials from their homegrown patch. If you're a local MSP that lives in Clackmannanshire or something with an awful lot of woodland in your backyard, you're going to have a vested interest in trying to see that material being utilized appropriately. And so I think it's not my role. We can kind of do our portion, but I think for some of these organizations to be able to front up to some of those politicians and say, and start poking and probing those questions, I think would kind of get some of that traction. I also wonder how much of a commercial vested interest there is in always saying C24. It's an old Canadian standard, isn't it? That the Scandinavians can kind of knock out the park because that's what their material delivers. Great, fantastic. Why would you want to kind of change that? So clearly there would be a commercial pushback and resistance to something like that, which is why it needs to be driven by policy, I think.
But I've got a question for Craig. Two questions, actually. I'm going to put them in one. Whose way of life, stroke business, is threatened by this shift to regenerative home construction? And then a follow-up, which is, one could perhaps think of additionally what is being offered to the marketplace rather than the threat to business. So it's about the changes that will come about due to this different model.
So in one regard, change has come about. We don't have placemaking as it once might have been aspired to be delivered. We have less and less resilience amongst our communities and more challenge, cost of living crisis, keeping warm, keeping safe. And so in one regard, if you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. So there's a kind of, I mean, that's glib to say, but then there are fantastic examples already delivered. And I'll put it in the chat, but Lilac had Westminster University do an analysis of what are the outcomes for the community, not just their own community, but the community that surrounded them, and then that actually the outcomes are fantastic in comparison to what I can do in terms of the energy reduction or the carbon storage. So that's kind of hardware solution. So the solution, I think, comes in the software part, people, centering people in it, and therefore the regenerative piece is regenerating communities. And I think Christiana led off with it's about humans and it's about the systems that need to be true to allow humans to thrive. And then the impact measures delivered as outcomes, so it's not soft and fluffy, it's measured, are real. The all of us would like to live in probably smaller footprint communities where we do know more of our neighbors than we currently do, rather than parking our car just outside our front door and rushing in to avoid catching the eye of the neighbor who insists on having a conversation with you. That's kind of weird that we got to that place, but actually, what if we just say, wait a minute, we can actually do this slightly differently? And then the regenerative piece is the bio and ecological, because we as species cannot just push and clean away all of the other stuff. We now need to ecologically embrace and bring in all of that. And that's why regenerative is now a new word that architects, especially young architects, are now trying to wrangle and take ownership of. And I think in part two, there's a session that Gail is leading. I'm mindful I'm talking too much here, but in part two, there is much more discussion around that. And I don't know whether Christiana want to just kind of talk about that social cohesion and glue that you were leading off with in your human-centered start today. I'll unmute you. Yeah.
I finally convinced my mic. Sorry. Yeah, it's an interesting one because obviously from a Wood Knowledge Wales perspective, to start with, that wasn't our core focus. We were focusing on the timber bit and on the forest and on the construction. But the community and cohesion part is extremely important, which is also why we have quite a lot invested into the small scale sawmiller community of practice, which, and probably our sawmiller can confirm that you don't have much time. So when do you actually attend such a meeting? And when it's online, and a lot of the small scale sawmillers don't really necessarily particularly like the time behind the computer. So we did that in drop-in sessions, and then every time there were 3 and sometimes some overlap, and sometimes there were a few more attending those sessions. But it's those kind of businesses that are rooted in the communities where you can still have a conversation with each other. It's the communities where you've got a community woodland group that is trying to look at, okay, so what else could we do with our woodland? What could we harvest from our woodland, that we could turn into usable products for the community, beyond the amenity piece, beyond the biodiversity piece, which are obviously inherently important. For me, there's also an element of social cohesion within the industry and how we talk to each other, how we treat each other, so that we can trust each other and we're not into the big against small or small against small or whatever it is, because it's that point where you can kind of overcome barriers and experiment with new ways. Like, for instance, it's incredibly difficult for smaller processing businesses in Wales to get hold of timber coming out of the Welsh Government woodland estate. That is because of their sales process. Now, you can't change that sales process overnight. So we managed to bring a group of small-scale sawmillers together. They said what they needed. NRW told us what was coming in the next lot. They said, okay, the direct route's not going to work, but here we have got a big client. He's going to buy this and this lot. Let us put you in touch with this guy, and maybe you can figure out something together. And that's what we did, and it worked really brilliantly. but it took guts. It took guts from the NRW staff member who was in charge of that particular forest and what was coming out of that forest. And, you know, it doesn't happen in other areas of Wales because there isn't two of her kind at the moment. And it really is at that point of the human, you know, who is engaged and passionate that we can make change happen.
Thank you. Esther, do you want to put your question to the panel?
Hi everyone. Yeah, my question was around like what's the potential to scale this approach? Like if you were sort of trying to convince an investor, yeah, what's your potential to scale? You know, do you have quantitative data to support how you're going to take over market share? And you know, what are there things that are stopping you or risks to that? So yeah, if I was like being a really skeptical audience, convince me that you can scale this. That was it.
Okay, so we won the prize, so I'm going to take that as our start. And the reason why Esme Fairbairn actually did this is because this is a key thematic. It's humans and nature. That's the kind of big thing. They're the largest charity in the one of the largest charities in the country, and the Royal Agricultural University, while England base, has something called Farm 491, which is a diversification model, and they were looking at what might regenerative solutions look like. So that's a start, and that's been brilliant, and it's paid for this conference. So that wouldn't have happened without that. So and then why would investors invest in this? Because it's a yielding model, because it yields the revenue from the carbon and social value trades are not one-off. They are done on three, this is now financial, this is kind of finance, kind of nerdy stuff. It's a recurring revenue model. The initial trade is for 3 years only because the future price of carbon will increase. So the corporate can only, and we won't take Aramco money through the platform, but we would certainly take corporate entities in Scotland's money through the platform as long as they weren't slave laboring or you know, building munitions and things like that. So there's a kind of quality threshold. And then what that happens is it starts to rotate. So the carbon storage comes in. The social value is kind of done once because that's the person now in a home as a result of that. But up the supply chain, if we move into field and forest, creating jobs locally, and then creating resilient communities that have less adult social care, I would say both private investors and local authorities, and in England we have combined authorities, and in Scotland the local authorities have enormous revenue challenges around adult social care, and I would say to them it's a spend to save investment, and to the private investor it's a yield investment and recurring revenue. And do you want to buy? I would say to the investor, you should be investing in the model. The reality is building homes, buying land is not rocket science. If land can be made more readily available at more affordable prices, and every local authority in Scotland is legally obligated, absolutely legally obligated. People imagine they can forget about that. They're not, because if I ask them how do they do their procurement is done on best value and will use social value calculators. If you're building a nuclear power station, you have to use social value calculators. So they do it on the procurement side. They do not do it on the asset release side. And then that can be challenged. The thing is not to go to court with local authorities. It's to gently show them the velvet glove, but remind them of the steel fist inside it, and that's the law. Then, how does the value of property increase over time? Because in effect, you build a home, it's a depreciating asset, but why do they go up in value? How does that work? And that's because that's postcode communities. That's communities doing better, being nice places to live, work, and visit. So the value of property is not intrinsic. It's the value of the community that chooses to say, I love my community. I'm going to do this. I'm going to open a cafe. I'm going to become a craftsperson in this, and I'm going to build these homes. So it sounds like it's apple pie. It's not. It's all financial, because homes do not increase in value. Communities do.
Thank you.
Are you going to invest,
Right.
Esther?
I'm possibly. It sounds all very nice, but I guess the bit that I'd like to see some more numbers and a bit more on like what's your biggest challenge to scaling?
Hearts and minds, I think, first steps. One, what I've learned is a statement of intent is important, as important as your technical know how to do something. You can say, I guess the guys who set up Airbnb said, we're going to do that. And we think it's possible, and now they're billionaires. So Uber, could we just do all of that off your phone? And there is no centralized facility. There's just a piece of software that does it. These were all statement of intent. And perhaps that speaks to the difference between the UK investment market and the American investment market. So I think I could sell this easier in America than I might be able to do in Scotland. There's a challenge.
Thanks, Craig.
I know, Hester, you're a supporter, not a challenger. So
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, probably everyone else on the call doesn't know that. So there's some context.
So thank you.
Absolutely a supporter. I'm personally looking for evidence to help win those hearts and minds. So that's why I asked the question.
I'll bring the certificates of carbon and social value trading, and then I'll flog them in Scotland.
All right. Thank you.
Mike, I haven't forgotten your question from earlier. Do you have the same question or a different one?
Well, it's slightly different. Thank you. Really interesting presentations. And I'm sorry that I sort of slightly dropped Guy in it by asking how much timber we need to
No, that was me.
solve the housing emergency. But I mean, I suppose I'm looking at kind of sort of two ends of the journey. At one end, the kind of sort of is about the provision of a sufficient number of homes, community cohesion, homes that are carbon responsible, etc., etc. So that's at kind of one end of the journey. And at the beginning of the journey is the growing of the timber. And I'm just wondering whether how the staging posts in between are being dealt with. Is anybody with a sufficiently big brain looking at these kind of sort of chapter headings and trying to kind of sort of record and report, you know, just how we might crack these individual problems? We've talked about land, we've talked about education in this session. There's a huge number of moving parts to that journey from timber growth to delivery of communities and housing. And I'm you know, with my sort of media hat on, I'm just curious as to who is kind of trying to make sense of all of that. Sorry that I've left you completely flummoxed.
Not flummoxed, just not trying to be the voice that speaks all the time. And so, well, what's the answer? Everything's complicated. That is a problem. Complexity isn't. The means by which we all arrive here is complexity on this call, but we all managed to get here to be that. And it's, you know, if I described what we're doing now 10 years ago, most people wouldn't even understand the idea that we would be in a virtual conference. So there is complexity, but we've learned how to do it. The policy world, I said this in Co-Housing Scotland, we all grow old and die waiting for perfect policy to land. But all MSPs can do, all the civil servants can do, is do the best they can on the nudge on the policy. So the thing that I think the difference is, you bring it down to communities, and what you find is the asset value of humans, using Christiana's description, in communities outweighs the capability of the professionalized civil servants. But what there is missing, there is no operating system. There is no professionalized operating systems for communities who might want to do some of this themselves to work with. And that's why you require, you know, annoying people like me who go poking around all the legislation and say, oh, by the way, you have to do this. And how do we structure finance? I'm not the big brain, I'm just a brain. But then what I've learned to do is then go and work with communities and say, did you know that this is an obligation that local authority has to attend to, but you have to describe it in their language, not your language. And so it's about languages, it's about education, and it's about sheer bloody-minded determination, and then professionalizing the layer that will be the gap between. So how do I go to a local authority and get land unlocked at social value? I haven't got a bloody clue about that. Well, you can come and speak to me, or you could speak to Christiana or others who are trying to participate in that. And so if you like, we're the professionalized layer, but we are tuned to listen to community, not to the system. Sorry, that was a double really sorry about that. I hope that nobody. Anyway, so so I think it's about finding that layer, and that's why we're working with Paul Chatterton, because Lilac we completed 15 years ago. That's shameful that there aren't now 10 more variants of that. So, but yeah, and Christiana, good, you put your hand up to stop me talking.
No, I find really interesting this question. Thanks for bringing it in, because in my view, who is doing all of that work? Who is bringing it together? Well, we are. Everybody on this call is part of that endeavor to make it happen, because I personally have totally gone off scaling. I mean, obviously, it does make sense up to a certain point. But if we're talking about scaling, then I'd rather go about deep scaling rather than upscaling. Because if we're operating in different places, you know, what we're doing, if we're trying to be regenerative from a regenerative development perspective, it needs to be place source. And while we can use a pattern book or Craig's house types in different places, they also need to fit in that place. And that means that the community needs to come together in their unique way. So the philosophy, the intention might be the same, and that's the thing you can bring, but it's more a source of inspiration, you know, to bring that into a place and make it happen with the energy that is there, with the people who are there, with the adaptations that are there, so that it will be cherished in that place as it was where it originates. For instance, the examples that Craig you brought from Bristol, you can't just use something that was invented in one place and then just flog it across and then put it into Glasgow or whatever, because the community there will tick in a different way. So you can learn a lot from it, and there are elements you can replicate, but not in the sense of how we've used the word scaling up. So I don't think, because as you rightly say, Craig, we're dealing with a complex living system situation, and therefore lots and lots of nodal points in a dynamic, evolving living system, which we are all part of, need to do their bit so that the system shifts. That's how I look at it. You can't centrally steer those things. It's not a top-down project management thing.
Indeed, you have to be in the community. Yeah,
I think I will have a go at Mike's question a little bit, in that, by example, actually, I think. So whilst no one of us would know across that entire full width, what we can do is, through our own actions, is join up some of those elements. So, for example, we've been approached recently with one of the local councils who want to utilize their own timber that they own into some of their own social value and social housing projects. And rather than simply put that material into the timber ecosystem and get some other stuff back, there's a sense of ownership of, actually, they want those trees appearing in their community. And so what we've done is to partner with them. We're going to mill that material for them. We're going to do some grading, some drying, and etc., and prepare that material, and actually send that stuff back to that community council or that local council to be able to build some of the projects and the accommodation that they want. And I think what that does is demonstrate that actually you're starting to then join up some of those larger lumps, and you're actually seeing then councils can say, well, hang on, if we want to do this again, we haven't got the material. We better start pulling together a bit of a plan around let's get our forestry bit in order. Or so I think through action and having some of those elements joined up, there's a chance for the additional upstream and downstream portions to become part of the way that people just operate. That's the way shit gets done these days, because people make those changes.
And I would just add the word radical has two different applications. Root, for sure, but action that is different. That's my definition of it. And the rule of this conference is don't come and describe the problem, come and describe the solution you think might work. Because part of it, if you look at how you're going to have to do all the systemic change with the multi-nodal points, you kind of give up. You would just go, oh my God, how on earth am I ever going to change that system? So what you do is you lower your eyes and you kind of go, so what do I do next? That might be an interaction that leads to an action, and that is that's systems thinking in action. Try to conceive of the whole as best you can, then work out where your node point is, because a node point is a leverage point, and a leverage point issues change. So I think part of it is we can sometimes get too expert in all the complexity and problems and forget that our job is to do the interaction and action. So that's why, in the chat, we've just got to delete everything that describes the problems and only save the ones that describe the solutions, and we'll probably move forward faster.
I don't know whether Tom's gone. I think I'm just going to chuck in.
Sorry.
Yeah, there he is.
There you are. Thank you.
Hi.
Off you go.
This
Put your camera on, Tom.
might be for Guy, actually. I just wanted to know a bit more about his experience of like using getting architects or engineers or designers to specify using, you know, different species of timber in construction, and also getting people to specify using untreated where it's put another way, using treated timber only where it's necessary, and how we get people to use that across the supply chain, and you know, just because it seems like, you know, you go to the builders merchants and really all that's there a lot of the time is treated timber, and it's, you know, commonly used for where it's not needed, and how you educate people to do that.
Guy, you're on mute.
I wouldn't have heard my amazing answer then. I'll try it again. Yeah, I don't quite know how to answer your question, Tom, other than, you know, as someone that pushes back on the specifier, on the engineer, because we do a lot of construction ourselves, and of course it's having that dialogue with the engineer. It's probably unfair to say that just, you know, engineers just specify the next one up. I don't think that's particularly true. I think there's ways that those engineers can look at the problem and design it slightly differently. But then, you know, one would imagine that happens, their knowledge about what's possible needs to come from an education system that sort of describes what those variabilities and options are. You know, it might be actually just increasing the section size by 5 millimeters allows it to go from 24 to 16, but they're not set up to think about that, because that's going to change the 2.4 by 1.2 panel width. And then you're into there's this kind of ecosystem of products that have been designed to sort of work in that sort of standardized building system. So I think, you know, it's down to people like Craig and similar organizations who are prepared to think differently. In terms of the timber treatment piece, I mean, I just keep coming back to the old anecdote of, you know, I fortunately or unfortunately live in an old granite house in the middle of Aberdeen, built in 1888. As far as I'm aware, it's still standing. And none of that was treated. Yeah, okay, the ends of the floor joists are a bit rotten because they never have a damp-proof course on the end. But I think it's this sort of anxiety around timber's just going to rot, or the bugs are going to eat it. I mean, there is something to be said for that. And as climate changes, and, you know, there are different infestations that come along, and having timber treated, I think as a customer, you get to Actually, not as a customer. I'm not sure many house purchasers will say, hang on, wait, I'm not buying this unless you tell me every piece of timber in this house is treated. I don't think that customer is really that thinking in that way. You know, does that have enough space, and can I put my massive flat screen TV on the wall? That's what they care about. Being derogatory, of course, but I think it's really down to the house builders to be asking those questions, and maybe part of the an educated public pushing back and say, can you tell me that this house isn't going to start off dancing through the rest of my life here? You know, what is it? What is in those materials that are actually being specified for my house? All of those all those glues in that particle board, is that really good for my health? So I think part of there'll be a pressure coming from, you know, the end consumer, the customer that moves into that house. But I think a lot of it really needs to sit with those timber manufacturers and timber fabricators, and it'll be quite a bold timber frame company that says, do you know what, we're actually going for non-treated timber, because I suspect they'll see their sales take a bit of a dent. But I noticed Neil is on the call, Neil Sutherland from Macca. You know, they've built an awful lot of houses out of C16 timber and been doing it very successfully for a long period of time. And might be interesting to get Neil's view if he's up for responding here. He would be a really good voice to answer your question, Tom. I don't know if Neil's up for that.
Happy to do that. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, I just actually posted something in the as you were speaking, Guy. It'd be nice to have a chat with you sometime soon. We have not used chemically treated timber in any of our projects over the last 30 years. Pretty much everything's C16, and you just drive. It's no point blaming the system or engineers or anything else. You just need to find a route through, as Craig said. You know, you take on the challenge and you find a way to solve it. The principal thing is making that distinction, deciding that you're going to use locally sourced materials and finding the way to do it. And there's quite a number of people on this call. Bernard Plantrose is there's a lot of experience in Scotland, I have to say, and it's great to see another generation coming through as well. I'm fascinated by Craig's economics, and we need to have a chat about that, Craig, because there's just so much we can unlock. It's such an inspiring kind of place we've got to really. One thing that we haven't touched on, which I think needs to be touched on, and I haven't rehearsed this before, I'm just going to speak openly, is the opportunity to develop a high-skill, high-wage economy around this, particularly advanced manufacture, utilizing a lot of the thinking. Most of the focus is on materials, but I think the process innovation needs to be brought into the discussion as well, in terms of innovation around how we do things differently, but really fire up young people. And this is one thing I've absolutely noticed at Macca, just how incredibly committed young people are when they get involved in this. It absolutely changes their lives, and that's underestimated. And an integrated approach to design, manufacture, assembly, and all the things that comes with that is truly inspiring. And I think we need to perhaps we can touch on that in the next parts of the conference. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Neil. Geraldine, just hold fire a second. I am aware that we're out of time, but if anybody wants to stay on, I am going to let Geraldine ask her quick question, if that's okay with the speakers. Just for those of you that do have to go, the sessions restart after lunch at 1:15. And if you've got any feedback on the sessions today, please use the CEDA email address provided in the chat instructions to provide some feedback. Thank you for joining. Geraldine, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Okay, thank you very much. My question is really about the finance. How are you financing the building phase of the schemes? I understand about using social value, etc., for the land purchase, but what about the building side of it?
So that's a classic challenge because there's quite a lot of grant to support the pre-building phase, you know, to get through to your building planning approvals and warrants. And then it just kind of falls because suddenly you've spent perhaps years getting to the position where you can put the planning permission, and then a lender is a new kind of animal that that project has to deal with. It has to kind of, you know, you've got to start speaking like a banker. So the way you do that is all. So if everybody on this call was a commercial developer, they'd know exactly the answer to that question, and that is that a bank, a high street bank, any old bank, will lend on property development at 60%. Some will go up to 70%. So at that point, they take what's called the low risk lend. Then you have another layer, which technically in finance world is called mezzanine finance. It's the kind of not quite, it's a little bit more risky, but it's not crazy. And that would be somebody maybe some additional support. And then the last bit is risk. It's all about the risk. Will this come off? And the lender on the risk gets their money out first. The mezzanine gets their money out second, and then the bank is probably there for a longer period or gets refinanced. So I'm now speaking the world of development.
Yeah.
So what CSVTs do is do the risk bit. It is not going to pay for all of it, but it'll be the bit that is the hardest stuff to get hold of. Then again, another innovation that has happened in England and should translate to Scotland because it's just finance flows, it has no accent. Is that the Homes England, which is the Housing National Agency, has worked with Lloyds Bank, and Lloyds work in Scotland as well, to do something called the Housing Growth Partnership. They will lend cross-nationally. And what the Housing Growth Partnership is there to do, in the financial crash of 2008, 40% of all homes were built by small local builder developers, somebody you might have known. You know, they fled the market. The Help to Buy scheme came in. The top 10 house builders in the country made money like never before. They grew fat, happy, and lazy. Any house builders on the call, I do not apologize for that statement. And so what the Housing Growth Partnership is designed to do is to rebuild that missing layer, that smaller SME, innovative, more local house builder. And the deal is for the Housing Growth Partnership, they will lend on million plus, they can't do less than a million. Say 10 homes for just the capital cost of the homes, perhaps. But what they ask is that risk investor or that mezzanine investor takes some skin in the game. If that's community, then that's 10 households saying, we can put down a deposit on this. And that's what Lilac did. They effectively took deposits in from the community. It was £280,000 across 20 family households. So not unfeasible. These are all waged and probably middle class in terms of the access. And then what Paul was able to do, along with Tash and others, was go to Triodos Bank and say, see our bank account, it has £280,000 in it. That's the mezzanine risk finance. And that's so a community development has huge financial strength if those communities are prepared to work together, because you aggregate the risk across the community, and the lender likes aggregated risk spreading. They really just love that it's not one person I'm lending to, it is an entity of which there are many members, and that's the Lilac is a co-op, is a highly modified co-op. So that's called the financial stack: your base lending, your mezzanine lending, and your risk. And this is a language that isn't comfortable for people in community-led housing. They have to do it. They are.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to our speakers, Christiana, Guy, and Craig. We hope you found this a useful session. There's a follow-up, another Radical Housing Conference in May this year, and we can carry on the conversations then. Thank you all.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks,
Thank you for chairing, Rachel. Fabulous job.
Pleasure.